Everybody, welcome back to another episode of Shifty's 49ers Talk. I know it has been a while, but we're back. We're doing videos. And today we're going to talk about my 5 favorite 49ers players for the 2022 season in fantasy. And then we're also going to talk about 3 sleepers, guys that you'll want to keep an eye on throughout the course of the year. Let's get into it. Coming in at number 5 is going to be quarterback Trey Lance. Now, Trey Lance is someone who has potential through the roof. I think that's no shock to say. Heading into 2022, he's in a really, really good situation. But before we talk about that, let's talk about last season. So he played in basically 2.5 games, played pretty well, all things considered. Just kind of being thrown in there in that game against Arizona. Houston, he definitely played a lot better, especially as the game went on. Now, for 2022, look, Lance is going to have a full offseason working with all these weapons. And you think about it, you got Deebo, you got Aiyuk, you got Kittle, you got Juszczyk, you got Elijah Mitchell, you got TDP, you got a bunch of these guys out there who have been in this offense, Jauan, Jennings, so he's surrounded by talent. He has a great coaching staff. And again, you're probably going to see Trey Lance in the preseason quite a bit, just so he'll be ready for week 1. Now, look, overall, he's still very, very young. So there's going to be bumps in the road. This season, I expect some games may not go so great, especially against the top-tier teams. But the things that Trey has going for him, great coaching, ton of weapons. He's going to get the reps now, and plus he can also run the ball. Now, don't expect Trey to run the ball 10 times a game or anything like that. I think Shanahan's going to reel that in quite a bit this year because you can't really have Trey get hurt. Ideally, he'll only be running when a play breaks down, make something happen with his legs, pick up a first down, maybe get a touchdown. Although, with that being said, I think there might be some design plays. Trey Lance has that ability, so in certain situations, you might see that happen. Overall, though, 2022, it's going to be ups and downs, so I don't think Trey is a consistent starter for anyone who wants to win their fantasy championship, but 2023, he's an ideal guy to really, I think, just blow up that year, and if you're in a dynasty league, I would definitely pick up Trey Lance. Coming in at number 4 on my list, it's going to be running back Elijah Mitchell. Now, this might be a little bit controversial. I think some people expect Mitchell to just be fantastic. He saw a lot of carries last year. I don't know if that's the case. But let's look at his last year, his rookie year. He played very, very well. He had 13.3 fantasy points per game, which is very, very solid and respectable. He had 20 rushes per game, and then he had 2 targets per game in the passing game. So he was definitely getting those touches that really allowed him to get those fantasy points. Overall, though, I think 2022 is going to be a little bit of a different story. I think Shanahan's going to want to spread the load out a little bit. There's a reason why we drafted a running back in the 3rd round of the draft, Tyrion Davis-Price. He's a little bit more of a bruising back as well. So don't be shocked if Elijah Mitchell gets some touchdowns poached when it's like 2nd and goal or it's goal to go, and they actually bring in TDP to maybe run in for the touchdown. Mitchell needs to stay healthy. If he wants to be considered one of the more upper echelon fantasy guys, he'll need to stay healthy. I don't know if that's the case. He runs really, really hard, so I do expect him to miss some games this year. But overall, I think if you have a star running back on your roster and fantasy roster, you have a couple of star wide receivers, you can wait a little bit, and I think you can still get Elijah Mitchell, who should be productive for you. Coming in at number 3 on my list is going to be the people's tight end, and that, of course, is George Kittle. Now, to me, Kittle is a top 5 fantasy tight end, not a top 3. Overall, as a player, though, he might be the best, but you don't get fantasy points for being a good blocker, unfortunately, for George Kittle. Overall, though, I think he's a guy who's going to have a very good 2022 season, although expect a slow start, in my opinion. And here's why. It's going to take some time for Lance and Kittle to really develop that rapport. The offensive line, especially the interior, it's still, quite a bit, work in progress right there. So I wouldn't also be surprised if early on, while they develop that chemistry, that you see Kittle maybe staying into block a little bit more. Maybe McGlinchey or Williams are kind of going to be kept in to help the interior offensive line to avoid any pressures up the middle. But overall, Kittle, we know what he can do. He's elite with the ball in his hands. He's fast. He breaks tackles. His yak is just unreal. And he's also very good in, really tight coverages. So in the red zone, he really has that opportunity to make plays. We saw it numerous times last season. I think back to games, I think it was against Cincinnati, and we all knew the ball was going to Kittle. I think it was like 3rd and short or 4th and short in overtime. Bam, right to Kittle. So many times in the red zone, we saw it against the Packers against the Rams on that game. Jimmy threw it up and Kittle made a great play on it. So Kittle's going to get his yards, but I think it's going to be a slow start to the year. Honestly, if I'm a fantasy owner, I'm probably going for guys like Waller. I think Waller's a better guy. Mark Andrews is going to get those touchdowns. You know how much Lamar Jackson trusts Mark Andrews. And then, of course, Travis Kelce. But with Kittle, I'll say one thing which will actually benefit him is, look, Deebo Samuel is firmly on the league's radar. People know about him. Before going into games, it was always, got to shut down Kittle, let the wide receivers beat you. But this is going to be a little bit different because teams are going to be looking out for Deebo. It's like, how do we stop Deebo? So Kittle's no longer the number one focus for opposing defenses. So I think once Lance and Kittle get that rapport, you're going to see some big games. But towards the end of the year, middle end of the year, I think that's when you're going to see Kittle. And that's the time when you can win your fantasy championship. Now, before we get into my top 2 fantasy players for the 49ers in the 2022 season, let's talk about 3 sleepers, guys that you'll want to keep an eye on throughout the course of the season. Now, number 1, it's going to be wide receiver Jauan Jennings. Why Jauan? Well, 5 touchdowns in 2021. He is always going to be a threat when it's in the red zone, when it's end goal to go. 6'3", 210 pounds. So he's got great size to match up with cornerbacks. His route running has improved immensely. Not only that, he's a favorite target for the 49ers in 3rd down situations. And he's really good with yak. We saw that especially later in the year. He really came on strong, started getting a lot more targets as the season went on last year. 5 touchdowns in 2021 for a guy who really didn't play that much is pretty impressive. Also, so far in mini camps, OTAs, Shanahan is just absolutely raving about Jauan Jennings. And should Aiyuk miss any time, I think you're going to see his targets bump right up. So he really has, high potential. He's not going to be really on anyone's radar when it comes to fantasy drafts. So someone to maybe stash deep on your roster is going to be Jauan Jennings. Think about him. The next guy, I had to choose one of these guys, but I'm going for running back Tyrion Davis-Price. So far, reports out of camp, the coaching staff love TDP. Rookie, of course, from LSU, 3rd-round pick. Now, here's a guy who I think can really come in, should have a role every week. I think he's going to be that goal line guy, so he could get you some touchdowns. Let's say if the running back that you normally have, if he's hurt or whatever, if it's a bye week, maybe Tyrion Davis-Price is the guy who gets you, even if it's 10 yards and a touchdown, that's still 7 fantasy points, so not too bad to fill in. But here's the thing, too. He's going to be maybe the primary backup to Elijah Mitchell. Mitchell missed some time last year, missed 6 or 7 games. So let's say if something like that happens again, then you might see his carries really bump up. So I think someone who you can get later but has a ton of potential, especially in those goal line situations. Last but not least, it's going to be a little bit of a tough one. I'm going to throw out the name Ross Dwelley at tight end, but it could be whichever tight end really steps up in training camp. And the reason why it's going to be very similar to the running back situation is that George Kittle, he misses games. The Niners basically have a tight end in the game on every single offensive play. So should Kittle miss 3, 4, 5 games, the guy who comes in could be someone who you really end up relying on throughout the course of the year. Ross Dwelley, so far, of all the guys on the roster, has shown the most ability to catch the ball in terms of route running, getting open, things like that. We know that Shanahan likes Dwelley. We brought him back for another year. So that's a name, just keep in mind. If for me, as a George Kittle fantasy owner in my Dynasty League, I love to have Ross Dwelley right there, just in case, Kittle does miss a couple of those games. So those are going to be my 3 sleepers just to keep an eye on through the 2022 season for the 49ers. And at number 2 for the 49ers fantasy ranking heading into the 2022 season, I'm going to go with Deebo Samuel. Now, this one might be a bit of a shocker. I think most people would have Deebo pegged in as their number 1 fantasy guy for the 49ers, but I'm actually going to go with another guy, and I think we all know who that is. That will be Brandon Aiyuk as the number 1 fantasy option. Well, let's get back to Deebo Samuel. So, we know how fantastic Deebo was in 2021, an all-pro. He threw for touchdowns, threw for a touchdown, ran for touchdowns, caught touchdowns, had 1,400 receiving yards. He was just fantastic. I think it would be very, very unfair to expect that kind of production again in 2022. Deebo has openly mentioned the fact that he doesn't want to run nearly as much as he saw in 2021, which will definitely have a noticeable impact on his fantasy value. So, I still think Deebo's going to be very, very good in 2022. I still think he could be a top 10, 15, 20 fantasy receiver in the league. Someone that you do want to have on your team. Because if you look at the 2 games that Deebo had last year with Trey Lance, when Trey Lance started, Deebo had 13.1 points in one game and 14.2. Of course, against the Houston Texans, he had that big 43-yard touchdown pass. So, he's going to get you points. He is a fantastic receiver. Teams will try and do what they can to slow him down, but Shanahan can figure out ways to get the ball in Deebo's hands. So I still think Deebo's fantastic. I still think he's going to have a very good year. But to me, Brandon Aiyuk is actually going to be the guy who has the most productive year. Now, let's talk about Brandon Aiyuk, my number 1 fantasy guy for the 49ers in 2022. I think Aiyuk is just ready to explode onto the season, much like Deebo did in his 3rd year in the league. Now it's going to be Aiyuk's 3rd year in the league. He has a great rapport with Trey Lance. We saw that game in the Houston game. Lance was going to Aiyuk quite a bit, and I think Aiyuk's route running, his speed, his ability after the catch is just going to get him open. It's going to get him a bunch of targets and really favorable positions. Now, when you think about the 49ers offense, the 2 guys who come to mind, who are they? Deebo Samuel and George Kittle. Aiyuk, in some ways, especially I think early on in the season, is going to be the forgotten guy where teams are going to focus on Deebo, they're going to focus on Kittle, and bam, all of a sudden Aiyuk, who's a fantastic route runner. Just look what he did against the Cowboys, Trayvon Diggs. Aiyuk is going to get open. He's going to have great mismatches. He's going to catch the ball deep, and he's going to make a lot of big plays. We saw a couple of times in that Cowboy game where Jimmy Garoppolo just couldn't hit Aiyuk, and he was wide open, maybe 20, 30 yards down the field. Lance will hit those, don't get me wrong. Plus, Lance is going to air it out too, so I think there's going to be plenty of opportunities for Brandon Aiyuk to have really, really big games. Not only that, we know that the 49ers are going to reel in Deebo in terms of running the football. I wouldn't be surprised if we see Aiyuk run it a little bit more on those end arounds, things like that. Maybe we even get him in the backfield a little bit. Let's throw some different looks at the defense. I could absolutely see that happening. In his rookie year, Aiyuk was very effective running the ball. Only he ran it 6 times, but had 77 yards and 2 touchdowns. So maybe Shanahan goes back to that a little bit more. We'll see. But I think, to me, Aiyuk is the guy who's going to end the 2022 season with the most fantasy points. He stays healthy. He's super productive. He does it all. Can't wait to see what Aiyuk does in 2022. Well, that's going to do it today, folks, for this video. I really hope you enjoyed my top 5 fantasy players for the 49ers in 2022, plus those 3 sleepers. Feel free in the comments, let me know your thoughts on the guys I selected. Of course, I want to hear your thoughts on who you think will be the big-time fantasy players, and especially throw in some sleepers, because maybe there's 1 or 2 guys I've forgotten about. But I'd love to hear your thoughts on it. As always, I really appreciate you guys, following the channel, subscribing, liking, all that good stuff. It means the world to me, really helps me out. And at this point, guys, I'm going to say 2 things. The butt counts, and I'll catch y'all on the flip side.